Hey guys. So, it's funny when many people are talking about philosophy and logic and stuff, many people like to compliment the Greeks as the fathers of these things, but it's weird that if you actually go back and read some of the ideas of Greek philosophers, I mean, because the Greeks invented a lot of cool stuff, but if you go to the philosophers in particular, you realize that they kind of were not as awesome as you thought. They're pretty awesome compared to, like, the people around in the Dark Ages. But I mean, here's some examples of some Greek thinkers who were pretty wacky. You've got Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. So the thing about Socrates is that it's impossible to criticize him because almost everything that was written about him was fiction and was written by Plato. Most of the stuff written about Socrates was just the imaginations of this guy named Plato, but Plato was a student. Basically, that that Plato believed in something called the world of forms, where he came up with this thing called the allegory of the cave, which was about figuring out the truth, even though it's painful. He came up with this story about these people who were chained up in a cave and could only see shadows, and they thought those shadows were real objects, and then they were freed and they could see the real objects. And they saw the sun, which hurt their eyes, but eventually they could see clearly. You know, that was the story. But Plato took that to mean that this world is a reflection of some world of ideas where there's imperfect versions of ideas, and there's a world of forms where there's all the different ideas that exist on this planet, but they're all perfect. And, while that this could have remained a possibility of being true, that instead of coming up with good evidence for this, he just said that using logic, we figure out this is true. But anyways, that Plato didn't have a lot of trouble lying to people to get them to believe things that he thought were good for them. He didn't want people to think for themselves. For example, that he basically said that we should lie to people and tell them that all people are descended from people made of gold, people made of silver, and people made of bronze. And then when people asked him, well, who would believe that? He was like, well, adults wouldn't believe that, but their children would be stupid enough to believe that. So there. But anyways, he wrote this book about, like, where Socrates is asking people a bunch of questions to figure out what morality is. But of course, though, that all these questions Socrates is asking more reflects the ideas of Plato than Socrates. But it's like Plato is basically kept coming to the conclusion that there was no morality, and yet he kept trying to search for these complicated reasons we should be moral people over and over and over, up until he came up with this idea for a fictional republic where that represents the human mind, and he said that if the king is the ruler of the republic, that king must represent the intellect, and that means that you should obey your intellect, and if that's true, that people should obey their kings no matter what. And that's why he decided to come up with that story about the metal people, you know, gold, silver, and bronze, because he was going to tell people that kings were descended from a superior race of people who were made of gold, whereas middle-class people came from silver and lower class came from bronze. And that's why you should listen to your king. But yeah, there's so many problems with this, like, you know, you should obey your intellect, but those other parts of you are important too, and being a moral person doesn't mean obeying your intellect. You need your intellect to figure out some of the things that are moral. Being a moral person just means not hurting other people because they're conscious the same as you. And they, you know, when you hurt other people, you inflict pain on them. That's all it is. Whether you agree with that or not is an entirely different question. But yeah, of course, you had a student, Aristotle, who basically came up with a lot of oversimplified ideas, like the earth is made out of, or the universe is made out of air, water, fire, earth, and ether. Kind of like the Greek thinkers who used philosophy to say that the entire world was made of water. So basically, it's just like, it's a good thing that science and philosophy became separate branches, because there's certain forms of thinking that work with philosophy that you can't use with science. But also, he said that that women were basically incomplete men with all these inferior traits, and that women were, the reason women have periods is because they're only half-finished men, so they have this error that causes them to, like, drip out blood every month. And he said that the reason women have orgasms is because that it's just a half-completed version of a man's orgasm. And he said that the climax and discharge from a woman just came from eating pungent foods, and this was only a problem with light-skinned women, and that those dark-skinned women don't have orgasms. And it's just really wacky. And there was Pythagoras, who came up with a lot of valid concepts, like mathematical concepts, scientific concepts like the earth was round, and he also invented a school of philosophy where its members were not allowed to meet him until they had a 5-year initiation period where they were supposed to take a vow of silence, and they weren't allowed to share school secrets with other people. And like, he basically, that he pretended he was being objective by saying that he used numbers to figure things out. But he was like, oh, well, numbers represent certain things, like 2 represents sadness and 1 represents happiness. So, you know, thus I can prove that 3 minus 1 equals 2, which is sadness. And, you know, he would prove a lot of philosophical concepts like that. So, yeah, it was just like a lot of wacky things. Just wanted to comment on that. Peace out.